Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Bicep for Real. This week we're going to be having a look at what I call main templates. And mainly what we're going to look at here is how do we start combining some of the work we've done already into a top level template that we can call to run everything we want. It'll make more sense in a minute when we go through that. So just a quick recap, we're still working on our Lambda Toys digital store project. We've got our environment here that we're going to deploy. We've deployed the vast majority of this now. We've got our Bicep templates for doing that. We haven't done the API management piece. We're going to come to that later. But everything else we've got deployments for. We're going to take a look at those this week and how do we take them to the next step and combine them into a single deployment. So let's hop on over to Visual Studio Code and we'll go from there. So if you remember from last time, we've got two Bicep templates now. We've got our core template, which has got some of our core resources like the virtual network, the Cosmos DB database, some NSG rules, things like that. And then we've got our ACA template, which is deploying our Azure Container Apps resources into that virtual network. And when we've looked at them before, we've run them separately. So we ran the core one by passing in some parameters from this dev.json file. And then we ran the ACA bicep one from the dev ACA JSON parameters. And we ran them as two separate operations to deploy them, and that all worked fine. But going forward, we're probably not going to want to do that, at least a lot of the time. When we want to deploy this environment from scratch, particularly if we're deploying a new environment, we want to deploy the whole lot. And we don't want to have to go about, running one, then grabbing some outputs from one manually and passing them into the other parameters and then running it separately and so on. We don't really want to do that. We want the option to just say, run this and do everything in the right order and get that deployed. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. We're going to have a look at creating what we're going to call the main template, which is the one that gets run at the top level, and how to call the other templates using Bicep's module functionality. So to get started, first off, let's go and create a new file and we'll call it main.bicep. If I can spell. Okay. And so this is the template we're actually going to call when we run the command line, when we do AZ new group deployment. This is the file we will call and pass the parameters into. So the first thing we need to do is set up the actual parameters that we're going to pass in. So as a starting point, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the parameters that we already have for the other templates that we're going to be calling, and we're going to put them in here. Okay, so let's just grab those, and then we'll trim them a bit because we've now got location and prefix twice, so we don't need that. So let's get rid of that. Okay. Now, some of these we are going to need. So location, prefix, the VNet settings we're going to need. But some of them we don't. So if you think like the VNet ID here, we're passing that into the container apps piece. Now, we don't need this as a top level parameter in our template. Firstly, because when you run the main template, you don't actually know what the VNet ID is. It's coming from the core template. And so we're not going to do that. We're going to need that as an output. So we'll look at doing outputs in a minute. Similarly with the container registry pieces, we don't need those because they're coming, we create that container registry in the core template, and the Cosmos DB pieces actually all come from that as well. So we can get rid of all of those because we're not going to pass them into the top level. So as a user, when I actually come to run this deployment, the only information I need to pass at the moment is the location I want to deploy it in, the naming prefix I want to use, and how I want the VNet configured. And you don't even need to pass the VNet because we've got some defaults here. However, I'm just going to paste those back in for a minute as a reference, because whilst we don't need to pass them in, we are going to need to get them from somewhere. And in particular, we need to pass them from the core deployment into the ACA deployment. And so the way we're going to do that is through outputs. We're going to have the core template register them as outputs that we can then consume in the other one. So I'm just going to cut those, and we're going to go over to our core template down to the bottom. I'm going to paste them in. Now this won't work, obviously they're not parameters, but these gives us sort of a to-do list to figure this out. So we're going to create some outputs. So outputs just use the output keyword, and we're then going to give it a name. So let's call it container registry name. It's a string, and then we need to make sure we set a value. So we've got our container registry somewhere here. Yeah, container registry it's called. So we'll call that container registry dot name. That's the value. And so that will create an output with that container registry name in it. So let's tick that one off the list. And we need to do the same for username. And because we're using the admin password for this, which is, say, not ideal, we talked about it before, you're probably better off using a token if you can, but that needs the premium version. So if we're using this admin key here, the admin key username is the same as the registry name, so we can put that in there. We could actually use just have the one output and use the same value at the top level as well, but this will keep it simpler. For the container registry password, because this is a secret, we don't actually want to pass the password. We put this into Key Vault, so we actually need is the ID of the secret, so we can grab that when we pass that in. So let's call that container registry secret ID, and that needs to be Key Vault secret.id. Okay, let's get that one. Now, container version, we do actually need as an input to the main template. So this is the version of the application we're going to use. We're going to vary that over time. So actually we did need that one. So I'll add that one back in. And what we should now then just need to do is set up the Cosmos ones as well. The account name. That's going to be SQL db.name. And then for the container, you remember we've actually got two containers. We're mainly interested in the state one, but we'll actually we'll output both of them. Spell a mistake there as well. Let's do that. Can't remember what we actually called it. So quick check up here. State container and SQL container. And then we'll add one for the SQL one as well. There we go. So we can just get rid of those. And those are all set. They will now provide outputs for this particular file. Okay, so we're all set for the outputs on there now. Let's head over back to the main template, and we need to call that. So the way we're going to call the core template first is we're going to use the module. Okay, so the module function is basically the way that you call into other Bicep files. It can be used for creating sort of reusable code, and we'll look at that in the future, or it can be just used to call other Bicep files. If you look behind the scenes when you do the ARM template, it basically creates a nested ARM template if you're familiar with those. So it's basically an ARM template within an ARM template. And so it's very similar to the other type of resources. It needs an identifier. So we're going to call it core. And then it's got this path piece here. So the path is replaced with the path to the actual file. Do we actually need that? I think we do. Yeah, so we put in the actual relative path of the file we want to call, in this case called a bicep. And what we should then find is we get some parameters, and so we're going to call it, we're going to call it core as well here as the name. This is just the name of the module. And then if we look into the parameters section, we should see is these are the parameters that are in the core file. Remember, we've got those three parameters. So let's pick those up for us. It's one of the great things about the Visual Studio code add-in. So we're just going to pass through the parameters that we've already taken from the top level template. So there you go. That's passed all those through. Now, this one is very simple. Obviously, the core one, we don't have many parameters, and they kind of mirror the parameters that we're passing into the top level template. If this was all we were doing, then you'd obviously question what the value of using a top level template is. But the key bit that comes next is that we also then want to call the ACA file as well. Again, we'll give it a name. And parameters. And this is where we see we've obviously got a lot more parameters. Now, some of them are going to feed straight through. So let's get those out of the way. So come back to that one. Okay. And then if we start with VNet ID, I think we might have actually missed this one actually. When we went back to the core, I don't think we created an output for it, did we? No, so let's add that in now as well. So we didn't actually create an output for this one. We'll call that VNet ID. And it's going to be virtual network.id. Okay, so that's going to output that as well. So when we come back in here, what we can do, sorry, to the main one, what we can now do is we can go to the core resource, calling it by this name, the core, that name there. And then if we go to outputs, and then we should see all of our outputs. And we want VNet ID. So you can see it's really easy just to pass values between the different parts if we use the outputs. So container registry name. Username. I'll come to the password in a minute. This is going to pass through. Cosmos account name. Cosmos container name. State one. And then Cosmos DB name. Cosmos DB name. Okay, so the last one we need is the container registry password. Right, so for the secret, there are two ways to pass in secrets from Keyboard. The first one is the one we used it previously with the parameters file where you pass it in as a parameter. That won't work for what we're doing here, obviously, because when we run the top level template, that secret doesn't exist. So instead, we need to pass it in as a parameter in here using the key vault function. Now, to do that, we need to make a slight change. So I did it wrong on the outputs with the core piece. So we've got in the core piece, we've got the container registry secret ID. We need to change that slightly. So let's get rid of that. What we actually need is the key vault ID and then the secret name in two separate outputs. I mean, we could probably do some string manipulation on the previous one and break those two out, but it's going to be easier to do it this way. So if we just do key vault ID, make that key vault ID, and then container registry secret string equals name. Set a string there. Okay, so that's good to go. So the way that the function to get the secret is a function called kv.get or keyvault.getSecret, and you can only call that from a key vault object. So in this top level template, we need to reference the key vault secret, or sorry, the key vault as an existing resource, so we can then call the function on it. So the key vault's created in this core module, and unfortunately, currently you can't pass entire resources as an output. You can pass them as an object, which is basically just ends up as JSON. But that, as far as Bicep concerns, isn't actually a resource. It's just a lump of JSON. There's no way to convert it back to a resource. So what we have to do here is create a resource using the existing keyword to reference the key vault that's created in this core module. Okay, hopefully that'll make sense in a minute. So we want to create, you're going to create a resource. Let's use the so we've got key vault resource. However, we're going to get rid of all of this because we're not going to use any of that because we're going to use an existing resource. So we're going to add the existing keyword, which is said we're referencing an existing resource. And we're going to give it a name as well. Let's call it secret key vault so we can distinguish it from anything else. Okay, and the only thing we need to put in here is the name of the key vault, which if you remember when we went and did those outputs, I actually put the ID, which you don't need the ID. you need the name. So we're just going to change this over to secret key vault name, change that to name, just prove that you can work with this every day and still forget how things work. And so the name here is going to be core dot outputs dot secret key vault name. And so we've hit another issue that I could have predicted but didn't. So this isn't liking this because basically what it's saying is it can't use the value of the outputs here because it needs to calculate the name of the key vault at the time the template is compiled. And we won't know that because it's coming as an output from here. And so this is a bit of a pain, and it's something we're going to have to deal with. So the only way we can do this basically is work out the name of the key vault based on the naming convention we use rather than getting it as an output. So if we go back into the core and look at our key vault, wherever it is, where we created it, this key vault here. And so this is how we named our key vault. Now we've already got the prefix passed in as a parameter here. So what we can do here is just do that. And that will generate the same name, so we'll get a reference to the same key vault. It's a bit painful, but it'll have to work. Okay, so this is pretty much good to go. At the moment, this will reference a key vault in the same resource group and subscription as the rest of the resources being deployed, which is absolutely fine for us. If that wasn't the case and the key vault was somewhere else, you can use this scope property to pass in the scope of the resource to a different resource group or subscription. That will work fine. Now, this reference here is fine at the moment. What you have to make sure if you're going to do this is that you don't try and call this key vault before it's been created in this core module. So creating the reference is fine. That should work regardless. But it's not going to be used until we get into the ACA module. At the moment, the ACA module has a number of values which are called from the outputs of the core piece. Therefore, that creates an implicit dependency between those two as well. If you wanted to be explicit about it, you could also come in here and do a depends on, and we could add core in there. You can have both. If you want to make it very clear that this depends on core, then we can leave that in there. So going back to our password, what we then need to do in here is go and get the secret key vault, and then there is a get secret function, and it takes in here the name of the secret that we want, which is secret. So that will, at the time we run this module, will go to that key vault and it will look up that secret for us and pass that in as a parameter. So we've got enough here that this should be able to run our template. The one thing we haven't done is add any outputs to the ACA app. At the minute, there's nothing using that, so we could just leave it as is. But it's possible that we actually, we're going to have some more modules after this, or some more resources we're going to call after this. Or maybe even the human who's deploying this might want to see some output. So in particular, let's add an output in here called API URL. It's going to be the FQDN of our actual API application so that we can then use that to go and hit it. And so we need to go in here, go into properties, and then configuration, ingress, deep one, and then FQDN. And that will give us the URL that Microsoft has generated of the actual application. Think there's anything else that will be useful at the moment? Obviously, we can add in more outputs later. You can add them as you go. That's not a problem. Okay, so we've got our main template here. This is what's going to get called when we deploy it, and it will then run the core piece, grab the key vault, then it will run the ACA piece to run the ACA deployment, and it will do that all in one go. Now, the nice benefit of doing this approach is the core and ACA templates still exist. They've still got all their parameters and so on in here. They haven't changed at all. We haven't done anything to them apart from add the outputs. So we can still call these independently. So if we do our main deployment, deploy everything, and then we suddenly decide, oh, we need to change something in the container app, or we need to debug something or whatever, we can still call the underlying ACA.bicep using our PowerShell deployment command and run that deployment separately from the other. We don't have to run the whole piece, but if we do want to run everything end to end, we can still run the main.bicep and run through that. So let's quickly go ahead and deploy that and make sure that all works. One thing we forgot to do, we need to amend our parameters file. So at the minute, maybe remember we've got these two parameter files that we're passing into the different components. We all pass them now into the main template. There's a much reduced list, but what we do need at the minute, this dev.json has the location and the prefix. We're going to leave the defaults for the VNet, but what we do need is the container version. So if we hop over to the ACA one, we should have this container version one. Yeah, we're just going to copy that and we are going to add it in here. To add that in. Now we could delete the dev.aca one here if we wanted to. I'm going to leave it in because if we want to debug just the ACA piece, we might want to use that. But for now, this should work. So the deployment didn't really go as planned. I tested it out. We got a few errors that we needed to deal with. So let me just run through some changes I had to make that deployment work. So the first one was on this container registry secret. So it didn't like that secret we were passing out as the output here. And it turns out, I didn't know this, but when you output a secret by the name, so as we're doing here, keyboard secret.name, it actually gives you the name is the key vault name / secret name. And we just need the secret name. So I don't know why it does that. Not very helpful. So what I've done here is just use the split function to split that value on a / and take the second value, see it's 0-based array, to give us the actual secret name and pass that as the output. So nothing changes in the main template. This was just done in the core one. That was easy enough. Where it got more painful was when I tried to redeploy the container apps, it didn't work. And it seems that the migration I mentioned before, the migrating from the Microsoft.web to the Microsoft.app namespace for container environments, seems that has happened and it wasn't allowing me to do updates. So what I did was just deleted those and recreated them using that new namespace. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite as simple as that. There have been a number of things that have changed, not just the namespace. So I'll quickly run through those, but I will obviously store the code on GitHub so you can have a look at this, and I'll link you to the migration guide as well that Microsoft produced. First thing, obviously, is the namespace change. So for the environment, the Kubernetes environment is changed to manage Microsoft.app forces managed environments and a new version. A few of the fields have just gone, so clean that up, and that'll be fairly obvious when you change the namespace. It will tell you that they don't exist. VNet configuration now has its own section rather than being the older container configuration section. And the names here, instead of app subnet and control plane subnet, they're now runtime subnet and infrastructure subnet. So those names have changed. A bit annoying. Probably the biggest change is that Dapper components previously were underneath the actual container app. Now they are within the environment and are available to all apps within the environment. So we need to move that up into this sub resource. And then you've got this new scope piece, which allows you to specify the scope of the component. So you can scope it to particular applications, which we've done here. We've scoped it to the Lambda API application. In the actual container app, again, namespace changed to Microsoft App for container apps. A few things removed to clean it up. Most of it is the same. The Dapper configuration section now goes in the configuration section. And that just has whether it's enabled or not, the port and the app ID, which is the same app ID you used in the scope above. The rest of the Dapper configuration with the components obviously is moved up above. And that's pretty much it. So took me a little bit of time to get that all working, but once we were able to do that, you can see that we were able to deploy successfully here. This is the command that we ran, just to zoom in a little bit. So same command as usual, AZ deployment group create, use the right one this time, the non-deprecated version. Everything else is the same. In resource group, the parameters file, the only thing that's changed is we switched to using the main.bicep rather than the subfiles. The parameters file is the same, we're not changing that. And that is it. And we go ahead and run that, and that will deploy and everything should work. And that's now completed and deployed as expected. And we're all good to go. So we've got that all sorted. We've now got our main template, which will deploy the resources in order. As we add more components in, we'll add those into the main template as we've done today, to make sure we can continue using that as our top level template. And that's it today. Next week, we will take a look at adding in API management and setting up our ingress so that we've set up secure ingress to our API, and how we add that into our Bicep template and deal with things like importing open API files and things like that. So hopefully I'll catch you then. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.